On June 21, 1945, inside the dark underground bunkers beneath Tokyo, official telegraph reports confirmed the total collapse of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Supreme Commander General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Soemu Toyoda stared in total silence at the casualty ledgers of the 32nd Army. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers and over 100,000 innocent civilians were dead. The southern defensive barrier protecting the home islands was gone. The strategic buffer zone had completely dissolved. American artillery was now positioned within direct striking distance of Kyushu. Yet, inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the catastrophic news did not trigger plans for immediate surrender. Instead, it ignited a violent political war between military fanatics demanding national suicide and calculating statesmen searching for a hidden exit. What did Japanese High Command say when Okinawa surrendered? The fall of Okinawa represented far more than the loss of an island. It was the destruction of Japan's entire defensive doctrine. For 6 months, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War had relied on Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and his 32nd Army to turn Okinawa into an inescapable killing field. The strategic objective had never been territorial defense or total military victory. High Command knew that the United States Fifth Fleet that possessed overwhelming industrial superiority, endless naval firepower, and undisputed air dominance. The real objective was strategic attrition. By inflicting intolerable human and material losses on the advancing American forces, Tokyo hoped to shatter the political resolve of Washington. They believed heavy American casualties would force President Harry S. Truman to negotiate a conditional peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. But when the battle ended, that calculations collapsed. The bloody sacrifice had failed to slow the American advance. Inside the briefing rooms of the War Ministry, War Minister General Korechika Anami reviewed the brutal statistical reality. The United States 10th Army had suffered over 50,000 casualties, including 12,000 dead. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. had been killed in action by Japanese artillery fire. 36 American warships had been sunk or damaged beyond repair, primarily by relentless kamikaze strikes. To the fanatic hardliners in the Japanese army, these losses were proof that the strategy was working. Anami argued before the Supreme War Council that if a single island garrison could inflict 50,000 casualties, an invasion of the main Japanese home islands would cost the Americans 500,000 men. He insisted that the blood spilled on Okinawa proved that Japan could still win a favorable peace through absolute brutality. The army refused to accept defeat. They saw Okinawa as a success. However, the Navy Chief of Staff, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, viewed the exact same figures with profound dread. Toyoda knew the catastrophic cost Japan had paid to inflict those casualties. The Imperial Japanese Navy had sacrificed its last operational capital ship, the giant battleship Yamato, during the suicidal Operation Tengo. Over 3,000 naval airmen had been lost in wave after wave of kamikaze attacks. Japan's aviation fuel reserves were completely exhausted. The naval air arm was virtually extinct. Toyoda quietly admitted to his staff that Okinawa was the final operational threshold. Without naval power, without oil, and without air cover, Japan could no longer stop the United States Navy from bombarding coastal cities at will. The defense of Okinawa had bled the Imperial Navy to absolute death. The fleet was completely gone. Behind locked doors in the Imperial Palace, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo seized upon the surrender of Okinawa to launch a desperate diplomatic offensive. Togo recognized that the military's strategic assumptions were totally delusional. He pointed out to Prime Minister Suzuki that the United States had not been demoralized by the horrific casualties on Okinawa. Instead, the American war machine was accelerating its preparations for Operation Downfall, the massive amphibious invasion of the home islands scheduled for late 1945. Togo argued that waiting for the invasion would guarantee the total physical destruction of the Japanese nation and the end of the imperial house. He urgently pushed for immediate diplomatic intervention through the neutral Soviet Union. Togo believed Moscow could act as a mediator between Tokyo and Washington before all leverage was lost. Was Moscow truly neutral? The intelligence presented to the High Command in late June 1945 painted a terrifying portrait of imminent economic and military collapse. The United States Navy had established an absolute submarine blockade around the Japanese archipelago under Operation Starvation. Merchant shipping had dropped to nearly zero. Raw materials, coal, and crucial food supplies from occupied Manchuria could no longer cross the Sea of Japan. Major industrial plants were completely idle due to lack of fuel and raw steel. B-29 Superfortress bombers operating from newly established airfields on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan were turning Japan's wooden cities into raging firestorms night after night. The fall of Okinawa allowed the United States Army Air Forces to deploy tactical fighters and medium bombers directly onto Okinawa's airfields, placing every major city on Kyushu and Honshu within daily fighter-escorted bombing range. Japan was systematically starving. Despite this total systemic collapse, Chief of the Army General Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu remained completely unyielding. Umezu commanded the Imperial Japanese Army's master plan for the defense of the homeland, codenamed Operation Ketsu-Go. Ketsu-Go was a doctrine of total national self-immolation. The Army had stockpiled over 10,000 aircraft, converting every available trainer and civilian plane into crude kamikaze attack craft. Millions of regular civilians, including women and young teenagers, were mobilized into the volunteer enlistment corps. They were armed with bamboo spears, muzzle-loading muskets, and crude explosive satchels. Umezu argued that when the Americans landed on the beaches of Kyushu, the entire population of Japan would launch a relentless, fanatical, human wave counterattack. He believed that on the home soil, logistics did not matter. Only absolute willingness to die mattered. The Army prepared for Armageddon. This fanatical resistance masked a massive historical misconception that still persists today. Popular history often suggests that Japan's high command was a unified, monolithic military junta, completely fanatical in its desire for collective suicide. Declassified military records and internal war room logs paint a vastly different picture. The High Command was intensely fractured, paralyzed by deep institutional hatred between the Army and the Navy, and utterly terrified of domestic political revolution. Prime Minister Suzuki and his civilian advisors were deeply afraid that if the war continued until the civilian population began dying of mass starvation during the winter of 1945, a communist revolution supported by war-weary citizens would overthrow Emperor Hirohito. The real war inside Tokyo was not just against America. It was against internal revolution. Consider the terrifying alternate reality if High Command had unanimously accepted Foreign Minister Togo's assessment in June 1945 and immediately surrendered upon the fall of Okinawa. Millions of lives across Asia would have been saved. The atomic blasts over Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never have occurred. The Soviet Red Army would not have invaded Manchuria, drastically altering the geopolitical map of Cold War Asia. But inside the Tokyo War Room, the Army held a complete veto over government policy. If the Army minister resigned, the cabinet would collapse, effectively shutting down the Japanese government. The Army used this structural leverage to veto any mention of direct surrender. They chose to gamble the survival of the entire nation on a single bloody final stand on the beaches of Kyushu. The trap was completely set. On June 22, 1945, the day after organized resistance ended on Okinawa, Emperor Hirohito took an unprecedented step. He summoned the Supreme Council for the direction of the war to an extraordinary private audience inside the Imperial Palace. Breaking with decades of strict political tradition, the emperor spoke directly to the 6 military and political leaders ruling Japan. Hirohito stated clearly that relying solely on military preparations for the defense of the mainland was insufficient. He explicitly instructed the council to pursue diplomatic avenues to end the war, specifically targeting Soviet mediation. The emperor had spoken. Yet War Minister Anami and Chief of Staff Umezu walked out of the imperial presence and immediately began sabotaging the diplomatic efforts. They delayed official telegrams, placed strict conditions on negotiations, and insisted that any peace must preserve the traditional military command structure intact. The clock was ticking down. The physical infrastructure supporting the Japanese war machine was completely disintegrating by late June of 1945. General Yoshijiro Umezu tried to project absolute confidence from his subterranean bunker, but the reality above ground was apocalyptic. American bomber formations operated with complete impunity in the night skies over Tokyo. Incendiary payloads systematically erased the industrial zones required to manufacture basic infantry weapons. The Imperial General Headquarters was forced to decentralize command nodes into heavily fortified caves dug deep into the mountainous terrain outside the capital. Communication lines between the Army Ministry and regional commanders relied on fragile telegraph wires that were routinely severed by aerial bombardment. Couriers on bicycles became the primary method of transmitting top-secret operational orders across the burning city. The most advanced military command in Asia was reduced to primitive messaging. Logistics vanished entirely. Operational cohesion was breaking down at the highest levels. How could they coordinate a massive national defense when they could barely communicate across the street? General Umezu ruthlessly poured every remaining national resource into the southern island of Kyushu. Operation Ketsu-Go demanded the complete mobilization of the civilian population to repel the anticipated American amphibious assault. Regional commanders received explicit orders to construct massive interconnected underground defensive networks mirroring the bloody fortifications of Okinawa. Entire mountainsides were hollowed out by conscripted labor to house hidden artillery batteries and suicide torpedo boats. The Imperial Japanese Army transferred its elite combat divisions from the northern territories directly into the projected invasion zones. These hardened veterans were instructed to show zero mercy and to expect zero reinforcements. The tactical objective was purely homicidal attrition. They planned to allow the American landing forces to establish a beachhead before launching a synchronized, overwhelming counterattack designed to push the invaders back into the sea. The plan relied entirely on suicidal bravery. Survival was treason. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo fought a desperate, isolated battle against the rigid military dogma dominating the Supreme Council. He placed all his diplomatic chips on the Soviet Union. Togo instructed the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, to secure an immediate audience with Soviet leadership. The objective was to beg Joseph Stalin to broker a negotiated peace settlement with the United States and Great Britain. Togo believed that the neutrality pact signed between Tokyo and Moscow would hold. He fundamentally misunderstood the geopolitical reality shifting beneath his feet. Sato sent frantic cables back to Tokyo, warning that the Soviets were stalling and displaying open hostility. The ambassador recognized that the Red Army was actively massing massive armored formations along the Manchurian border. Sato practically begged Togo to realize that Stalin was not a mediator but a predator, waiting to strike. Tokyo ignored the warnings. The delusion was absolute. Why did the Supreme Command blind themselves to the impending Soviet invasion? Admiral Suemu Toyoda struggled to maintain authority over a fractured and dying naval fleet. The catastrophic losses sustained around Okinawa had obliterated the central command structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Remaining warships were trapped in local ports without a single drop of fuel to run their massive engines. They were reduced to floating anti-aircraft batteries waiting to be slaughtered from the sky by American dive bombers. Toyoda realized that his regional commanders were beginning to operate entirely independently of Tokyo. Base commanders hoarded localized supplies and prepared for their own isolated final stands. The centralized authority of the Navy Ministry was evaporating into thin air. Toyoda faced a humiliating reality where his direct operational orders were physically impossible to execute. He could not project power across the Pacific Ocean. He could barely project power across the naval base at Kure. The naval war was completely over. The admirals were paralyzed. The atmosphere inside the Imperial General Headquarters bunkers grew increasingly toxic as the brutal summer heat intensified. Stagnant air and the constant vibration of American bombs hitting the surface frayed the nerves of the Supreme Command. Staff officers worked in a state of perpetual exhaustion and severe clinical paranoia. Factions within the army began spying on each other to identify anyone displaying defeatist attitudes or whispering about surrender. Junior officers discussed launching a violent coup against the civilian government if Prime Minister Suzuki attempted to negotiate peace. Assassination plots were quietly formulated in the dark corridors of the War Ministry. General Anami knew that his control over the radical elements of the army was slipping rapidly. The fanaticism he had cultivated was now threatening to consume the entire command structure from within. The greatest threat to the Japanese government was no longer the American military. It was the Japanese military. Japanese military intelligence agencies failed comprehensively in their assessment of American strategic timelines following the collapse of Okinawa. General Umezu and his staff operated under the rigid assumption that the United States would require several more months to stage an invasion fleet. They believed the seasonal typhoons would force the Americans to delay Operation Downfall until late autumn or winter. Gross miscalculation provided the Supreme Command with a false and deadly sense of security. They assumed they had plenty of time to solidify the Kyushu defenses and finalize the diplomatic maneuvers in Moscow. They possessed zero knowledge of the highly classified Manhattan Project. They had absolutely no conception that a weapon of unimaginable destructive power was already being assembled on the island of Tinian. The intelligence apparatus had completely collapsed. The Supreme Council was planning a conventional defense against an unconventional apocalypse. The blind spot was fatal. What would happen when their timeline shattered? The civilian population of Japan was collapsing under the weight of systematic starvation and total economic ruin. The American naval blockade had severed the vital supply lines required to feed millions of isolated citizens. Government rations were reduced to absolute starvation levels, forcing families to forage for acorns and wild grass to survive. Prime Minister Suzuki received highly classified reports detailing widespread malnutrition and skyrocketing infant mortality rates across the home islands. The civilian police forces warned the cabinet the widespread civil unrest was imminent if the food supply did not drastically improve within weeks. Suzuki understood that hungry citizens could not fight a fanatical war. The military strategy of Ketsu-Go relied entirely on a population that was physically too weak to lift a wooden spear. The home front was dying. The illusion of national unity was cracking under the unbearable pressure of biological survival. Consider the immediate political catastrophe if Prime Minister Suzuki had openly defied the military and declared a unilateral surrender in July. The radical elements of the Imperial Japanese Army would have instantly initiated a violent military coup d'état. General Anami would have been forced to arrest or assassinate the entire civilian cabinet to maintain order. The country would have plunged into a bloody civil war right as the American invasion fleet approached the coastline. Japan would have faced total internal annihilation before a single American soldier stepped onto the beaches. Suzuki recognized this terrifying reality. He knew he had to maneuver the Supreme Command toward peace without triggering a domestic military uprising. He engaged in a deadly political dance with men who considered death preferable to diplomatic compromise. Every word spoken in the Supreme Council was carefully calculated to avoid a mutiny. The political tightrope was agonizing. The fragile political equilibrium completely shattered when the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration in late July. The declaration explicitly demanded the immediate unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, or face prompt and utter destruction. The document completely bypassed the diplomatic back channels in Moscow and delivered a direct public ultimatum to Tokyo. Foreign Minister Togo viewed the declaration as a potential framework for negotiation if the status of the emperor could be guaranteed. However, the military hardliners viewed it as a supreme insult to the national. Reject the terms and execute the Ketsu-Go defense plan immediately. The Supreme Council was permanently deadlocked. 3 members desperately wanted peace. 3 members rigidly demanded total war. The paralysis was absolute. Nobody possessed the constitutional authority to break the tie without invoking the direct intervention of the emperor. Prime Minister Suzuki made a catastrophic tactical error in his attempt to appease the military hardliners while keeping diplomatic options open. He announced to the Japanese press that the government would ignore the Potsdam Declaration, using a highly ambiguous term that implied silent contempt. This political maneuver was intended for domestic military consumption to prevent a coup. The American intelligence apparatus interpreted the statement as a total and aggressive rejection of the surrender terms. The diplomatic window slammed violently shut. Suzuki had inadvertently sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of his own citizens. The Supreme Command retreated back into their subterranean bunkers to await the Soviet response from Moscow. They sat in the oppressive summer heat, clinging to a delusion that no longer existed. The clock had finally run out. What hidden nightmare was hurtling toward them from the skies above the Marianas? By late July 1945, the nuclear shadow loomed directly over the Pacific Theater, while the Supreme Council in Tokyo remained frozen in ideological debate. The Manhattan Project had completed its final assembly on Tinian Island, completely unbeknownst to the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. Intelligence officers under General Yoshijiro Umezu continued to prepare defensive beachheads along the coast of Kyushu, entirely convinced that conventional amphibious warfare would dictate the final chapter of the war. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki attempted to maintain a delicate balance between military hardliners and civilian ministers, but his ambiguous public statements regarding the Potsdam Declaration effectively closed the last avenue for diplomatic compromise. The military apparatus continued to hoard crude kamikaze aircraft and mobilize millions of civilians with bamboo spears under the Ketsu-Go defense doctrine. Japan stood completely isolated, its navy destroyed, its cities burned, and its high command waiting for a Soviet diplomatic intervention that was never going to come. The stage was set for the ultimate historical catastrophe. When news of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima reached Tokyo on August 6, 1945, the Army General Staff initially refused to acknowledge the true nature of the weapon. General Umezu and War Minister Anami dismissed early reports from naval radar posts as Western propaganda, insisting that no single bomb could destroy an entire city. They dispatched nuclear physicist Yoshio Nishina to Hiroshima to conduct a physical investigation, deliberately stalling any political discussion of surrender until scientific confirmation arrived. Even after Nishina confirmed that Hiroshima had been obliterated by an atomic device, the Army hardliners argued that the United States could not possibly possess more than one such bomb. They insisted on continuing the war, believing the human cost of landing operations on Kyushu would still force the Allies to negotiate. The High Command's psychological denial maintained its grip on the empire. Was there any weapon that could shatter their resolve? The final geopolitical blow struck in the early hours of August 9, 1945, when the Soviet Union officially declared war on Japan and launched a massive armored invasion of occupied Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet troops backed by heavy artillery and armor shattered the Kwantung Army's defensive positions along the border. The collapse of Manchuria destroyed Foreign Minister Togo's entire diplomatic strategy. The Soviet Union was no longer a potential mediator. It was now an active enemy threatening to invade Hokkaido. Hours later, a second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. The double shock of Soviet invasion and nuclear devastation forced the Supreme Council for the direction of the war into an emergency meeting beneath the Imperial Palace. The military hardliners were stripped of every strategic assumption they had relied upon since the fall of Okinawa. The entire defensive framework had completely collapsed. Inside the underground air raid shelter of the Imperial Palace on the night of August 9, 1945, the 6 members of the Supreme Council remained deadlocked. Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai advocated accepting the Potsdam Declaration. War Minister Anami, General Umezu, and Admiral Toyoda insisted on 4 strict conditions: preservation of the imperial institution, self-disarmament, no foreign occupation forces, and Japanese-led war crimes trials. Recognizing that the council was permanently paralyzed, Prime Minister Suzuki executed an unprecedented constitutional maneuver. He turned directly to Emperor Hirohito and requested an imperial decision. Hirohito addressed the council, stating that continuing the war would mean the destruction of the Japanese nation and further bloodshed across the globe. The emperor officially declared his intention to accept the Potsdam Declaration. The imperial decision triggered an immediate violent backlash within the staff ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. Young officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka viewed the acceptance of unconditional surrender as a betrayal of the emperor and the fallen soldiers of Okinawa. On the night of August 14, 1945, Hatanaka and his co-conspirators launched a military coup d'etat. known as the Ketsu-Go incident. They seized control of the Imperial Palace grounds, placed Emperor Hirohito under virtual house arrest, and murdered the commander of the Imperial Guards Division. The rebels searched room by room for the phonograph recordings of the Emperor's surrender broadcast, intending to destroy them before they could be transmitted to the public. War Minister Anami refused to explicitly support or crush the rebels, torn between his loyalty to the emperor and his devotion to the army. The coup ultimately collapsed in the early morning hours of August 15, 1945, when General Shizuichi Tanaka of the Eastern District Army arrived at the Imperial Palace and personally ordered the rebel officers to disperse. Realizing their mission had failed, Major Hatanaka and his co-conspirators committed ritual suicide on the palace grounds. War Minister Korechika Anami performed ritual suicide at his official residence, leaving behind a farewell note apologizing to the emperor for his failures. At noon on August 15th, the voice of Emperor Hirohito was broadcast across the empire via radio, announcing the surrender of Japan to a stunned and weeping populace. The long, bloody chain of military command decisions that had begun on the battlefields of China and ended in the war rooms of Tokyo was permanently broken. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender documents were signed. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed on behalf of the Imperial General Headquarters, alongside Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu representing the government. The fall of Okinawa, which High Command had once viewed as a potential leverage point to force a conditional peace, had instead served as the gateway to absolute military occupation. The fanatical doctrine of Ketsu-Go, the sacrifice of the 32nd Army, and the refusal of the Supreme Council to face strategic reality in June 1945 had only prolonged the destruction of their own nation. The decisions made inside the Tokyo war rooms during those final summer months stood as a testament to the fatal consequences of command paralysis and ideological delusion. The historical trajectory of the war in the Pacific was fundamentally altered by the dynamic between strategic military necessity and ideological rigidity. Japanese High Command's reaction to the surrender of Okinawa demonstrated how military leadership can become trapped by its own propaganda and structural mechanics. Even when operational defeat was absolute, the internal power balance between the Army, Navy, and civilian government prevented timely decision-making, directly leading to the devastating events of August 1945. The archival records of the Supreme Council reveal that the primary concern of high leadership in those final months was not tactical victory, but the preservation of institutional power and national identity amidst total collapse. The lessons derived from the collapse of the Japanese High Command continue to be analyzed by military historians and strategic analysts worldwide. The unwillingness of military leadership to accept verified intelligence data, combined with a refusal to prioritize civilian survival over doctrine, created a scenario where absolute destruction became the only mechanism capable of breaking the political deadlock. The events following the fall of Okinawa serve as a stark historical case study in the dangers of strategic denial, command friction, and the human cost of prolonged conflict. Had the Japanese Supreme War Council accepted Foreign Minister Togo's assessment immediately after the fall of Okinawa in June 1945, would the deployment of atomic weapons have been completely avoided? Or was the Imperial Army's internal power structure destined to force a catastrophic climax regardless of diplomatic options? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.